It is your officially this is officially the first episode playing since your St. Louis City SC has clinched the MLS playoffs in their expansion year. Everybody, let's celebrate. Matt, how's it going?
Couldn't be better. 0-0 draw against the second best team in the conference. It was a weird night that we're going to recap a little bit before looking ahead to Minnesota, but all of that kind of seems secondary to the fact that we are a playoff team in our first year, the first team in the Western Conference to qualify for the playoffs after so many national pundits wrote us off at the beginning of the year. And it's been a while since we've looked at what those predictions have been, but I thought it was a great opportunity on social media to kind of bring back all of those 14th place, 13th place predictions, because when you're the first team in your conference to qualify for the playoffs, you've done something special in just general, but let alone being an expansion team to do that, it's unheard of.
It's no secret that Flyover Footy is kind of a chip on the shoulder kind of a title of a podcast, and I've always felt that way about St. Louis soccer. And the pundits didn't let us down this year. Extra time and all those pundits around the country, every single one of them thinking we'd be 13th, 14th. I want to say publicly, I don't blame them for thinking that. That's typically what an expansion team does, but it feels so good to have surprised the entire world, to prove them all wrong in this situation, at least. And I'm gonna dwell on it and enjoy it while I can.
We have to. And I don't think there's any malice behind the dunking on the national pundits and the media. There's just some friendly jabs and back and forth. But it's like you said, I don't blame anybody nationally from discounting St. Louis City SC. They didn't follow us in the preseason. They didn't follow the roster build. They weren't as intimately familiar with what was going on with City 2 last year, the concept behind the system and getting everybody in early and the runway that provides. We were. And so that's why we took it personally on this show, especially when we heard all of those, because we had a lot more detail and information to go off of. We knew the background so much better. We believed in this so much more than just being excited about being here. And we thought we could compete. So to see all of those 13th, 14th places, it was the start of the chip on the shoulder start of that for MLS that we had begun with USL and everything that was before this with Flyover Footy, because it's one of the more fun things when people ask me, why is your podcast named Flyover Footy? It's like, well, it starts with how everybody coast to coast thinks of Missouri, St. Louis as flyover country. And from there, it's easy. And when you have people with that perception and not even spending enough time on the intricacies of what's going on, and then you have a St. Louis team in their first year be the best team in a conference through 30 games, the first team to qualify, yeah, we're going to celebrate that as appropriately as we should.
Absolutely. I guess we could sum up this season and our feelings with that Michael Jordan, and I took that personally gif from the documentary. It feels very much like that. And just like Michael Jordan, they took it and run. It was kind of the tackle and fuel I keep mentioning.
And we're not the only ones doing that. Chris Gebhardt in the chat mentioned that today the Missouri History Museum commented that they took it to the next level, framing the 29th place prediction by MLSsoccer.com and putting it in the Soccer History Museum exhibit. And that kind of thing, like taking it to the next level of, yeah, we know what you thought of us, and we know how well our team has performed and how proud we are of what St. Louis has done in this league. We're not going to let you forget about it.
Love it. Well, that's just step one. Making the playoffs is step one. And we're in a position where that's maybe not enough for us here in St. Louis, because the number one spot in the West is up for grabs. And I truly think everybody wants it badly for multiple reasons. Right, Matt?
We have 4 games left in the season. There are 2 records that we're chasing as far as expansion teams go, and they're Atlanta United and LAFC in their initial expansion seasons. So looking at what we need to do to kind of reach those next milestones is part of what's left in these 4 games. We have LAFC, who had 57 points in 2018, finishing 3rd in their conference. We had Atlanta United in 2017 with 55 points, finishing 4th in their conference. And so you look at the strength of schedule, the strength of teams in any given year, points is something we're chasing too. So we've got things ahead of us in these next 4 games. We've clinched a playoff spot. It's likely that we've already ensured at least a 7th place spot if everything goes absolutely off the rails. So we're looking at securing a first round spot, not in those wild card. We're looking now at home field advantage. We've talked ad nauseum on this show about how important home field advantage is, knowing our home versus away record. So that to me is right up there, 1A, 1B, when we're talking about how far this team can go. Securing home field is next. Bradley Carnell mentioned it on Thursday's press conference, is that they're looking at this one game at a time, but when they reach those milestones, they will celebrate it. He was texting the team last night, the middle of the night after everything was over, and letting everybody know, hey, we clinched. Take a moment to celebrate. But it's business from here, and you get to the next game and the next game until you can say we've secured home field, we've secured the conference, we can secure this greater than 57 points to be the all-time greatest expansion team. Like those are the milestones we have to look forward to in these next 4 weeks. So yes, big moment to celebrate right now. We come off a massive matchup against LAFC. We went toe-to-toe with them that we're going to look into in a moment. Celebrate now, but as we look forward to Minnesota, it's back to business and back to figuring out what's next for St. Louis City.
And if you listen to this show, we've been laying out how difficult this last little stretch of games is. And, let's dig into LAFC because it is a perfect example. To kind of skip ahead a little bit, I don't know if St. Louis City has looked this bad, not for a long time at the very least, at home against a team. And LAFC was a really tricky out on this one.
Interesting, though, that you would phrase it that way, because I think in the sense of our attack, you could argue that we looked bad. There were some really interesting moments, especially in the second half, once we had shots on target and we started to have some opportunities, the way that they were taken advantage of from individuals making individual efforts as opposed to distributing and working as a team in the attacking third. But what I thought was really most interesting is the lineup that we ran out there in a lot of ways can be seen as one of our best 11. We talked a couple weeks ago, Santi and me, on Flavor Fallout about what our best 11 could look like. And we covered it on Flavor Footy the other week, that there are multiple iterations depending on what you need out of our lineup. And the lineup that we ran out against LAFC, I thought it was very much an attacking minded lineup, starting 11. When you have Anthony Marcanic and Akil Watts as your fullbacks, you obviously have Joachim Nilsson and Tim Parker as your center backs. And then you pump in a diamond, a 4-4-2 diamond. So our midfield was Blom as the pivot, Leuven on the left, Vasilev on the right, AZ Jackson as your 10, and you're trotting out Sam Adeniran and Joao Klaus. When in a lot of the moments, Klaus was playing more of a false nine or an underneath second striker, so to speak. And there's a lot of interesting looks that gave, but it didn't really amount to much, at least in the first half. And we saw that in the XG, where the expected goals for St. Louis in the first half was just 0.18. LAFC had 0.41, which also look, we have to pivot to talk about the defense in a minute, but 0.18's nothing really. And so at City Park, that was a little bit of a disappointment to see that we couldn't break through the line. It got better in the second half, rising to 0.59, where you saw consistent opportunities from Sam Adeniran a few times, Nico Gioacchini when he came in. You had I thought our second half was a lot better offensively, but I do think defensively, it was quite the stellar performance against an LAFC team who themselves are typically high goal scorers.
I agree with everything you said. I loved, it was cool because I think LAFC is typically considered one of the more, we play beautiful soccer kind of teams in MLS. And I love that we pulled out the diamond to play them because I think that's kind of the considered the beautiful soccer formation. Now, not in the way that St. Louis uses it necessarily, and Philadelphia does the same thing with the diamond and pressing. But I loved that thought. And no matter how you lay it out, it is a more attacking formation than a lot of what we've seen, especially with arguably two-way fullbacks in the lineup. And I think that was my only worry going into this, to kind of wrap up what your point was, is can we defend against an LAFC with such an attacking lineup? Can we defend from the front? And the defending from the front was a little bit rough. We went a long time without more than a couple, maybe one or two turnovers in LAFC's half. And that's usually our bread and butter. And so that's when I started getting a little bit worried that we didn't get any chances off of turnovers in the opponent's half early in the game. Maybe one or two that I missed, but usually there's several in the first, 20 minutes. So I thought that was strange. LAFC looked like they were playing the game they came there to play. And they just have so many weapons, and each weapon was kind of getting their chance all over the pitch. They were just doing a really good job, and I worried because St. Louis wasn't controlling the game quite as much as a typical home game. Now, I don't think they were out of their comfort zone, but that just talking about the first half, that's I wasn't feeling comfortable at this point.
You can see a little bit more possession than St. Louis was used to, and it kind of progressed as the game went along to where it ended with St. Louis actually having 52% possession. And this, we know historically, St. Louis doesn't win matches when they have more than 50% possession. I think a draw was a good result from this because given the way the game flow progressed, and especially after the subs came in the second half, when you're possessing the ball as much as St. Louis did, that's not our bread and butter. It's not what we are typically efficient with. And so you're looking at guys like Akil Watts, Anthony Marcanic, and as the game went on, and we started to see some substitutions get in there. Eventually, Tomas Ostrak, Jared Stroud, Nuke V. Thorson, the way that they changed up the wing look, it was, I think, an attempt to battle LAFC in the wings. Diamond formation really didn't give us a whole lot up front. I thought some of the dynamics between the fullbacks and the wide midfielders was interesting at times, especially on the left side where Marcanic and Leuven. And Bradley Carnell spoke to that a little bit with the diamond formation, really talking about how Edu Leuven, mentioning how he's a great player on the ball. They gave him a lot of flexibility and freedom with the diamond, and how Anthony Marcanic reads the game really well. Carnell, post-game, was saying that when Edu is outside, Marcanic is inside. And so knowing when to flow where at any given point. And then talking about how LAFC themselves are good at the press. And so PPDA is a stat that we mention all the time on here. It's one of my favorites, is because of St. Louis's style in highlighting high pressing teams versus teams that might sit back a little bit. And you're going to see a juxtaposition between LAFC and Minnesota in that LAFC is much more like St. Louis. They were very much a high pressing team, and they'll push you. And so part of what Carnell said, the reason we ran with the diamond is to get around that, to give some of the guys some wider angles and to help progress the ball. But I thought in progressing the ball that way, that's what led to our possession and our lack of numbers up front. And I never really thought that there were significant moments of bite from Sam Klaus and AZ consistently enough to threaten. And the low XG, the low number of shots on target in the first half kind of highlighted this. I don't honestly have very many highlights in general to talk about in the first half. I thought it was a dogfight, to say the least. I thought there were a lot of battles in the midfield in between the attacking thirds. And when that happens, you're really relying on guys like Ilie Sanchez versus Jabulu Blom in who can control the ball more. I was impressed by Ilie Sanchez, first of all, like I always am. I thought that the work that he does is very apparent. I love watching the game from the ends because you can see these plays develop. And when you see the way that Ilie Sanchez was playing so deep to LAFC's back line, he was able to really dictate where the ball goes. And that's why he is essentially their quarterback of their team, is he can by himself determine how they're progressing the ball. And that's by design. Conversely, I don't think Jabulu Blom really had as good of a game as he had previously had. There's been some conversations about his overall passing effectiveness, which I didn't think was on display last night. I thought he was very quick to distribute the ball as opposed to carry the ball, even when he had some open spaces, and which would have allowed him to maybe create for others, draw some people into him, and then distribute where the openings lie. He was more quick in getting the ball up the field as fast as possible. And that led to a lot of opportunities for LAFC to put pressure on us higher up the field. And so those two styles back and forth between the defensive midfielders, I think, was one really interesting key to how this game continued to develop.
Yeah, I think a lot of the first half, I think, were the two teams feeling each other out, because you mentioned several tactic moves that St. Louis and LAFC typically use in a game, and I think they both changed it up quite a bit, and neither one was doing what the other expected to do, because I don't think St. Louis was choosing to press high every single time. I think they were worried about that counterattack and getting too many guys forward, at least early in the game. And so I found that, St. Louis was possessing the ball in their own half, and they kept waiting to bait LAFC and just passing it around the back, and they never baited. They never went in for the bait. And so, at that point, we saw Berkey launch it long to our two giant forwards, which I thought, great, I like this. Like, go ahead, don't press us. We'll just launch it forward. And I think we saw that wasn't useful in this game, unfortunately. And maybe it was just because LAFC was prepared for it. They were sitting back a little bit more, I think, than typical. But it was just like all these tactical wrinkles, things were different. And I feel like it's a little taste of the playoffs, because once the playoffs start, there's this whole season of data that everyone kind of prepares for. And then you see these changes, you see these maneuvers of playing styles and different tactical moves. And so I thought this was really fun. I wish I could get into the two coaches' heads in this one throughout the game and hear them even talk about it. It'd be really fun because I think it was all over the place tactically.
I do think this was interesting in the sense that previous games recently, we've played teams that have very different styles than us, and they are more possession based. And so we can see there's St. Louis style, and there's whoever we're playing, Houston or otherwise, that they want to possess the ball and they're willing to use their strengths in the midfield or in the channels, like with Sporting Kansas City, in how they can create opportunities by possession. LAFC is more like St. Louis, where they attack differently, but the intent is the same, where they don't want to possess the ball 55-60% of the time. They'll possess it quickly, move the ball up very directly, and then try to do the same high pressing that St. Louis does. And so seeing how St. Louis plays teams like this, where it's not whose style is going to, it really is whose style is going to win out. It's not whose style is going to be the better, the more effective. It's who's going to win out, because you can't have two teams that don't want to possess the ball. And in that sense, St. Louis kind of was forced to possess a little bit more than I think we were comfortable with. We did get off a few notable distributions up high. Berkey had an amazing distribution in the 75th minute. That was just a pinpoint accurate ball to Nico Gioacchini. But that kind of is a microcosm of what ended up happening, where the ball might have been played from Marcanic high or from Berkey high, even Watts or Nerwinski, but nothing ever really came from it because the back line of LAFC was very, very strong. Chiellini, full credit to him, and Carnell gave it to him after the game as well, played himself a tremendously strong defensive game. And LAFC's back line did a great job of holding and preventing a lot of the back and forth, whether it's a Klaus heel kick or AZ passing it into space. That wasn't there for St. Louis. And so their LAFC's backline stymied us quite a lot. And it led to some of these stat lines that we were not necessarily used to seeing. But I think that does lead to things like St. Louis outpassed LAFC 302 to 280. LAFC led in shots, but St. Louis led on shots on target. So it very much was a back and forth in all of the key stat categories as well. And so you're looking at styles of play, who can win out, who ends up with more efficiency in their play. I think this was a good test in a lot of respects as we go forward. And it hammers home the importance of home field advantage. I don't know if this game would have progressed differently if LAFC was the home team. And so knowing that St. Louis was able to go toe-to-toe with a team that previously beat them 3-0, lineups aside, I mean, they won 3-0, and we've been beaten by certain teams on the road that are of really high caliber. Seattle, RSL, like some of these top teams in the West, when we're away, it's always a different story when we are at home. Real Salt Lake is about the only team I think that you could say they beat us at home when we were injury plagued. But a healthy St. Louis team at home, I fully believe can go toe to toe with any given team, win, draw, win in shootout, whatever it takes. And this kind of proved that point to me.
Completely agree. I think that game planning is a thing that we don't see as much in soccer as we do in some of the other sports that St. Louis has. And this game just felt like a game planning game that LAFC came in and enforced those statistics that we don't care to have. And so, Matt, I think you laid that out very nicely. You're listening to Flyover Footy on the Big 550 KTRS. Matt, should we maybe figure out, nail down some of this game flow, get kind of on a schedule here and move on, or what would you like to do?
We've got a couple takeaways I think from this game. Some are really good, and I do think that Joachim Nilsson, Chris Gebhardt in the chat mentioned it, and that he's the one player I really want to hammer about the takeaway from here, because he put his body on the line. We would be doing a disservice to him if we didn't mention him. There were a lot of players who had good games. Roman Berkey had a good game with, I think, 3 key moments is what Bradley Carnell said, but otherwise a quiet night. I thought that Thomas Ostrak was good at the 6 when he was asked to do something he doesn't normally do, and he had to come in at the end of the game for Indiana Vassilev. Like, full credit to him for helping to keep the clean sheet. That was a good performance. Indiana Vassilev himself had a strong game, I think, moving from different positions. Akil Watts going from right back to central defensive mid when he needed to. Like I mean, it was a full team effort, but Joachim Nilsson, the guy he was hit in the head, he was in the shoulders, he was hitting the legs, he was on the ground, I don't know how many times. He was literally giving his body for this draw. And
Mhm.
for him in particular, we know the story, but over the past few weeks, to see him almost hang on by a thread in a lot of ways, where we're hoping he doesn't need his knee drained. We're hoping that his groin is okay in certain scenarios. We're hoping he's able to play a full 90. And then to go with this performance, the full game, and have all of these different things occur during the game. Like, this is the St. Louis spirit that we love from guys like Tim Parker and Jared Stroud, Indiana Vassilev, who are physical. They're putting their bodies on the line for what needs to happen. Joachim Nilsson had quite possibly, I think, the best game he's had in a city kit.
Completely agree. I thought he was the player of the game just because of that. I thought he was all over the place and he was great. And, I think it was really evident to the two styles of play, what is asked of the two teams' center backs. And, Parker and Nilsson were sprinting every probably 10, 15 minutes. In fact, I worried they were sprinting too much in the beginning of this. Leuven, too. And then things settled down a little bit, but you did not see Murillo and Chiellini, sprinting side to side to catch up with a counterattack. And so massive difference in styles of play. In fact, if Chiellini had to exert too much physicality, it felt like he just grabbed his ankle and went to the ground. Don't think he was touched on the ankle once in the entire game. I was losing my dang mind during that. But, I say that mostly to say that, we ask a lot of our center backs, and you could see Nilsson's gears turning. He's like, I could tell there was once or twice where he was like, I'm not sure I'm going to get to this, or I know if I go all out for this, it's going to hurt. And you just saw him do what he had to do to win the game. And for me, it was like that Bundesliga level player using his brain and his physicality and everything else, every tool he has in the toolbox to kind of keep that keep that clean sheet at the end of the day. And so I thought he did well, not to give any less to anyone else.
No.
I felt good about the 0-0 draw. Matt, one more thing I just wanted to say is, like, if I could give the coach the player of the game in this one, I think I would. And I think perhaps we could always look at a game and say, yes, he could have done better. He could have done something to get that goal, just that one goal. But I just love there was a definite plan, and there was definitely chess moves throughout the match, and using the player subs, it could have gotten out of control. It could have gotten weird. We've seen some weird formations at the end of a game because Carnell will just throw players on just to try to get that win. And we got a little bit of that vibe, but it was cool to see the attacking rotation, especially. You mentioned Klaus at the 9, and it just started with, I think, Gioacchini coming in as a 10 for Azil, and the two big guys up top. And then I think when Sam came out, it moved around a little bit. Klaus was kind of playing the 10 or a false 9, and Nico was extending the line, running in behind. And I just enjoyed watching that rotation. I love that St. Louis isn't a stringent positional team like the U.S. national team. He's not afraid to sub in and go crazy to try to get that win. It's so much fun to have a team that is fun to watch, that our coach is willing to have fun with the lineup and give guys chances for the win instead of, conservative play.
And on that note, I think the last thing I have to say about this game is that our attackers going away, because this is a good takeaway conceptually going forward. Bradley Carnell said that they let Nico Gioacchini roam around in the 10. They let Klaus go underneath in the 10, trying that out. But the big thing to me is today, or at the Thursday press conference today when we're recording this, is that Bradley Carnell mentioned his willingness to go with 3 in the attack, 3 forwards to end the game. So you had Nico Gioacchini sub in for Aziel Jackson, so that brings on an extra forward, but you're playing Klaus underneath, you're playing Nico underneath. When Nuke v. Thorson entered the game for Sam Adeniran, you fully had those 3 attackers, because Thorson was playing up front an awful lot on the left side. You had Thorson, you had Gioacchini, and you had Klaus. And Carnell said at the press conference that he wanted to do that because those were their best players. And he wanted to get their best players out there because they earned it. And he wanted to see them all in the field at the same time. And he felt that they weren't sacrificing anything defensively. The fact that Thorson came in at 78, we were able to have 3 attackers and 3 full attackers, not just pulling back 1 into the 10, but 3 full attackers, and kept a clean sheet the rest of the way. that says just as much to the rest of the game or to any one of these moments or these importances that we're able to roll out different variations of our formations and lineups, having different personnel, 5 at the back, 3 at the back, 3 at the front, wing backs, whatever it is. When you can run those out and try to see what's effective offensively while still keeping your shape and keeping your principles defensively, that's a foundation to build off of. To know that you are confident enough to put those players on the field together at once, not concede. That is as much of any knowledge going forward on what you're capable of and what options you have that can work that you need anywhere else. And so that's a takeaway for me going forward, is that 3 at the front is now a viable option because of how strong we were showing us defensively to end that game.
Yep. And those chances weren't being taken quite as much before Nilsson. So it's just a little mental note there that I just kind of realized. Let's move on. You're listening to Flyover Footy on the Big 550 KTRS. Thank you so much for joining us. And now we're going to do a little bit of previewing the Minnesota United game that's coming up. Only a couple days after this Wednesday night brawl against LAFC. So Matt, why don't you get us started with some fun facts about this matchup?
3 days rest. St. Louis, we all know, clinched a playoff berth. First team in the Western Conference to do so, sitting first place in the West with 50 points through 30 games. Just the third expansion team in the modern MLS era to get to 50 points in their expansion year. 15, 10, and 4 record with 56 goals scored, 38 goals against, and a plus 18 goal differential. Going into Minnesota, important to remember, we are 5, 7, and 3 for our away record. Our form in the last few games, we drew LAFC midweek, we drew Houston last weekend, and we drew the LA Galaxy. We are, oddly enough, we've had 3 draws in our last 3 games, whereas in the 27 games before, we only had 2 draws. Kind of an interesting juxtaposition to what our recent capabilities are and plans are compared to what we had been doing beforehand. Roman Berkey picked up his 8th clean sheet against LAFC. So we have 8 clean sheets. We haven't won a game since midweek against FC Dallas. So run of form or draws. Dallas and then Austin are our 2 wins since the Leagues Cup break. We haven't won away since July 8th at Toronto. So that is something to keep in mind, where draws have been the name of the game lately. Winning away has still somewhat eluded us. That's important for City. On the flip side, Minnesota United not doing too well on their end. They've dropped to 10th place in the West. They are currently outside looking in on the playoffs with 37 points through 29 games, a 9, 10, and 10 record with 37 goals scored, 38 goals against, a -1 goal differential. They're 3, 3, and 8 at home. They are drawing like crazy throughout this season. Their form in the last 3 games, they've got a 4-3 loss against the Galaxy midweek, which you can't do anything but describes that as a dagger. Up 3-1 at half. They lose Reynoso, who we're going to get to in a minute, and then they concede. They have a red card, and then they lose the game. Just an absolute dagger to go into this St. Louis matchup. Before that, though, they lost to Sporting Kansas City last weekend, and then before that, they drew the New England Revolution the week before 1-1. Just like us, they have 8 clean sheets on the year, only 2 since the Leagues Cup break. Their last win was August 30th at home against Colorado, 3-0. They have had some interesting acquisitions, and I'll say, or arrivals. Let's say arrivals, because one's an acquisition, one's a return since the last time they played St. Louis. So since the last time they played St. Louis, which was our 6th match of the entire year, and they ended our 5-0 start to the season, they've been 3-3-3 in MLS play since Teemu Pukki arrived in July through the transfer window. So they acquired Pukki from Norwich, and he was supposed to be their number 9, their goal scorer. They haven't had a stellar record since his arrival. Emmanuel Reynoso is the other player. So their designated player who had a sordid offseason and didn't arrive. I don't know if he held out, if he wasn't allowed in the country, if he had legal troubles, whatever the issue ended up being. He wasn't with the team until June. When he rejoined the team in June, they've been just 4-4-6 in MLS play since. This past week, along with the player availabilities that they have issues with season-long injuries, Reynoso himself is, I would say, questionable. They haven't given an official designation at the time of this recording, but they're missing Rayan Jiba, Robin Lode, and Kevin Arriaga for season-ending injuries, all with knees. But Emmanuel Reynoso is the biggest one to watch. He was subbed off at halftime against the LA Galaxy match with a thigh injury that he originally suffered against Sporting Kansas City last weekend, and it was said by Adrian Heath post-game, he said, quote, with it being 3-1, which it was at half, they were up. He said it was starting to stiffen up. Heath goes on to say, I didn't want to risk it because I know what that's like. I know what he's like. He would have stayed on for the whole 90 minutes. We have to look at the big picture as well. We
Hmm.
have 3 huge home games coming up that probably will define our season. So looking at Reynoso in particular and what his impact can be, he's questionable to go because of this thigh injury. But if you take Adrian Heath at his word, at face value, it seems like Reynoso will play against St. Louis. And an Emmanuel Reynoso team is different than Minnesota United without. And so what we saw at the beginning of the season, maybe an indicator in how they pass the ball and how they progress it and what their low block might be on defense. But with Reynoso in the game, anything's possible up front.
Yeah, I mean they play through them. It's just like the classic main DP designated player on your team in MLS. You have that one playmaking guy that you just get the ball to, and that's just a way to score throughout the whole season. And he's exactly one of those. Big stories. Let's keep pushing here, Matt. I know we've got a lot knocked out, but we have some big stories and some styles of play. If you'd like to touch on that a little bit as well.
I think the biggest one to watch for is just the injury to Reynoso. Is he going to be available? What's his status going to be going into the game? Because that could change a whole lot of things. Also,
clearly style of play, like just defend, counter, low block, and give it to Reynoso, right? That's Minnesota.
It kind of is. And so you look at both sides. So intangibly, I do want to address some of the intangibles in mindsets going into this match. So Minnesota, we mentioned, coming off that rough defeat. They're now on the outs for the playoffs. What is going to be their mindset and their willingness to go all out to get a win? Do they view this as a must-win game? Because in a lot of aspects, you should say, yes, they do view this as a must-win game, especially getting back on track. I think with the stretch of 5 games they have left, if they lose at home, that's going to be really disheartening going forward to try and make this push back into the playoffs. But does St. Louis have a bit of retribution on the mind? So Minnesota mentioned ended their historic 5-0 start at City Park with a 1-0 win. It came on a penalty kick, so it's not like they had any sort of massive game flow effectiveness against us, or the fact that they were always hammering us. No, it was a pretty even matchup until a Kyle Hebert penalty call, and it was not a smart play. But no goals in the run of play allowed against Minnesota in that game. Will St. Louis be able to find a different approach? Will St. Louis rotate? That's a big story for me. This is our 3rd game in 8 days. We're going to have a week off before Sporting Kansas City. So what lineup are we going to run out? Thinking some names out here. Jake Nerwinski, Akil Watts. You look at who's played recently. Both of them have seen significant time over the past couple of games. Josh Yarrow might be an option for Joachim Nilsson, who mentioned how physical his game against LAFC was. Could we see a Yarrow appearance? Thomas Ostrak came in late. We could see Celio Pompeu. Is this a time that Nukvi Thorson can start? Maybe Kyle Hebert makes a return. Would we rest Klaus? Like, these are questions, given the context of the past 2 games, that you really have to think about. And I often go back to that San Jose Earthquakes game where you had a game in a period of 3 days. You rotated 4 players, and all of a sudden, those 4 players took their opportunities and ran with it. Sam, Akil, AZ, and Josh Yarrow. And that became a core of our team for a period of time. So do we try something different here where Bradley Carnell goes with this approach of whoever's in the best form, who's ever fit, and who's ever kind of next man up philosophy? Who's ready to go? Who's in the best form to compete? Because we know that he's kind of formation second, player readiness, player form first, and he'll make whatever formation fits the model for who we're playing against. But that also goes to kind of the big story here of who we're playing against. LAFC and Minnesota are vastly different teams. And so another component of this is going off of 3 days rest, 3 days between games where your opponents are incredibly different. Bradley Carnell said in the Thursday press conference, we look at references of what we did before, what the Galaxy did last night. We have a lot of video, interesting tidbits we put together based on data, who's fit and healthy for us. We know there's 2 tails for this Minnesota team. They're difficult to break down when they're on the road. It's different for them at home versus away from home. And that's kind of an interesting thought. So looking at, we could talk for days about their formations. They usually run 4-2-3-1. We could talk about how they move the ball up and how their midfielders drive everything from Will Trapp to Yohani Dotson. Their midfielders really run things up to Reynoso when he's in the game. They have a similar possession style of St. Louis, where it's basically the back half, the middle between the channels of the defensive half is where they possess. Otherwise, they kind of go out quickly. The passing over the last few games very interesting to me because you do see a little more propensity for attacking when they're at home. We saw the low block in person. We saw what that's like and how difficult that was for St. Louis to break down when Minnesota was on the road. But what do they look like when they're at home and they have these opportunities to be more attacking? And that's, I think, what Carnell was alluding to, is looking at the passing networks of the last 3 games. You're seeing higher average positions for guys like Will Trapp and Yahani Dodson and Jan Gregus. Like, these guys are in significantly different positions when they're at home. And whether you say it's a home crowd dynamic or if it's just something subconsciously that Adrian Heath does with his team or what the players do, they seem to be taking a little more chances. They have more shots on target at home versus away. So it's an interesting dynamic, I think, that Carnell pointed out, that we may see a low block, but we also may see more opportunities for a counterattack if Minnesota is a little more open with the kind of offense that they're throwing at City. That would be the really big opportunity that City has going into this, is inviting Minnesota in a little bit more, continuing to be willing to let them possess the ball more than they did in the first game, and then just hitting them on the counter, being very clinical on the wings and the channels. Minnesota loves to clog up the midfield. Their passing networks show that they live in the midfield, beat with 6 players in the attacking end when they're at home. And they usually have their 2 fullbacks out wide, significantly wider, and around midfield, defensive midfield areas. So there's an opportunity there to really break free if we can have 2 or 3 of our attackers string some things together.
Yep, and talking about the schedule, I think that's going to be a massive. I'm going to come back to that, way back to that. I just want to kind of say that, after this game, there is a week of rest before Kansas City, but it's only like 4 or 5 days. I think 4 days before Vancouver, and then a
Yeah,
long break for the
long break.
international break. So
It's weird.
yeah, and so I guess I'm kind of curious to see what happens in this one, because I think we might see a repeat of whoever's needing rest to be a repeat when we get to the Vancouver game. And I want to say that Leuven looked pretty tired last night. I don't know if you felt that way, but Leuven didn't quite look like himself in this last one. I think he either had a weird game or he's getting tired. And so,
Yeah.
we saw him rest a game recently. It was a big shocker, but honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if he misses the first 60 minutes of this next game. That said, we just heard, if you listen to that Tim Ream podcast, I finally started listening to it regularly. Weston McKennie said he would rather play every 3 days than, have once a week, just for keeping informed. Now, he's a younger guy. So I'm just curious. I don't know what each player is going to feel like. Probably all of them want to play every single game, but I'm curious who's going to get a rest in this one. And then looking at the way that Vancouver plays, I thought Sam was good in his style of play. And then when we were forced to lump it forward, I was kind of braggy about having 2 really huge guys up top, but that's strangely not Sam's forte, or at least it wasn't in this game against LAFC. And so with a low block, I'm actually leaning toward, if we just go with style of play, I think this might be a Nico and Klaus game. And so I'm not sure how anyone else will feel about that, but Sam seems to be just loving the counter, pushing out to the wings and getting some people on the defense on their back foot. It's what he thrives at. And then he's able to get some set piece headers in. And so I'm curious to see what will happen with St. Louis as far as their lineup and resting, and who's going to be good against this low block, more than likely that we're going to see against Minnesota.
Yeah, and that's a good point about Sam, and I think not just the stylistic matchup, but it was telling Nico Gioacchini didn't start against LAFC, and his growth as a striker who can hold the line. We don't typically think of him in that regard. We think of him as more creative and a playmaker, a second striker. But with Klaus out, I think we were able to see a growth in his game. And so
Mhm.
I personally would be comfortable with him right alongside Klaus, or even starting in a 4-2-3-1 by himself to
Yeah.
start the game. And knowing that Klaus went the full 90 again, knowing that Sam went 78 against LAFC, and Klaus is coming off 2 games going 90. So that's the first thing.
Mhm.
I can't see Klaus starting this game. Like, I just don't. Like, I would be surprised, not shocked. I would just be surprised if, having started 2 games, first 2 games back, playing the full 90, and then 3 days later, another 90. That seems like a lot. when you have a guy like Nico Joachini, this is a perfect opportunity for him. Heck, you could even go with Joachini and Thorson if you wanted up top as a perfectly fine and an interesting two striker combination that I would
Mhm.
be very intrigued to see how Thorson's direct to goal nature can play off this, while Nico Joachini could be a line holding striker. And knowing that Minnesota stretches themselves, or they're very a tight team when they're at home, and so they stretch the field a little bit more, but they're very compact in their passing.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued in how our midfield is going to attack this, because one thing we haven't really talked about too is Jabulu Blom. I mentioned how I was a little disappointed in some of his distribution in the game against LAFC. Post game, Bradley Carnell had some kind of interesting comments about Jabulu Blom in the sense that he's got a foot thing going on. We didn't get any clarification today about what the foot thing is, but it was also very I'll just say troublesome to
Hmm.
hear that he apparently took some medication that was messing with his stomach, and he wasn't able to get right at halftime, and that's why he was subbed out at 58 minutes. And so I don't want to make any kind of wild guesses. I'm just saying it's something to follow, and it's kind of worrisome that uh, happened. And so, from a foot perspective, from a medication perspective, we just hope that he gets right and he's healthy, he's fit, and he's able to go, because a healthy and fit and in form Blom is a game changer,
Hmm.
especially defensively. And that could be a big thing to watch for. Indiana Vasilev, another individual player, I wonder if he's able to go at least to start. I would be surprised, given the fact that he was so gassed at the end of the LAFC game, if he's a starter in this next game. I think it's a perfect opportunity for a guy like Jared Stroud to get back in the starting lineup. He only entered in the 78th minute. So we've got a lot of interesting personnel that St. Louis can roll out. But Phil, real quick before we go, because I know we're running out of time, my keys to the game, I want to get those in. Keys to the game for me are for St. Louis to create space wide, pulling the Minnesota low block apart as you work through, because I don't doubt that Minnesota is going to try and have us possess the ball. It's going to happen from time to time, even in transition moments where we can stretch their back line wide, create some spaces for Tomas Ostrak or any of our midfielders and our second striker to get in underneath. That's going to be huge. But we also have to protect against counterattacks, remain strong centrally, and prevent a lot of the link ups between the lines. I mentioned Will Trapp and Hassani Dodson. The midfielders progress the ball really well, and they're the leaders in a lot of their passing categories, especially passing categories and getting the ball into the final third. Will Trapp is huge for that. He's going to be who the ball moves through as they progress it from the back line through to the front line. And so if we can shut him down, take away his space, make him uncomfortable, we're going to have a lot of success in preventing the ball from effectively moving up. And that's probably where a lot of the keys will lie in when Minnesota possesses the ball, is put pressure on Will Trapp and Hassani Dotson.
And we noticed in the last game against Minnesota that they don't, unlike us, yes, it's a low block, yes, it's compact, but we try to get the ball away from them up high on the pitch, and we just attack high and look for the ball wherever it is. They wait for a pass, it seemed like, and once that pass got to someone near the midfield or further, they pounced on that player. And they're more compact, there's less field to deal with, and so it's much easier to get to that person quickly. And they do that. They do a very good job. They're really good at interceptions and turnovers and dual percentages. And that's something that gives us trouble. So, Minnesota is a matchup freak against someone like City. And so, it will be a tough game, but we don't have to worry about that. Yes, LAFC was good at some of that as well, but Minnesota doesn't have the punchback power that LAFC does. So I'm curious how Cardinal will attack this one. I agree with every key to the game you had there, Matt, but I think we better close it up if we can with lineup predictions.
Lineup predictions and score. I heard feedback that we didn't give a score prediction last week, and
I love when we forget the score prediction.
Yeah, and I had the right score from the last week. It was that 1-1 Houston, so we got to get ours in. My lineup prediction. I don't know. It's kind of obvious what the formation I think would be. Either a 4-4-2 or potentially a 4-2-3-1. Kyle Hebert, I think, is back in the lineup. Hebert, Yarrow, Parker, Nerwinski. I think we're gonna, and I could see Watts being there, but I'm iffy on Blom. So part of Nerwinski being in the lineup is Akil Watts starting in the midfield. I do have Edu Leuven in there, Nuke V. Thorson, Tomas Ostrak, Celio Pompeu, and Nico Joachini. I have a heavily rotated lineup, and I'm maybe just preparing myself mentally for that possibility, but as opposed to willing it into existence.
A few things I really loved about your lineup. I don't think that'll be quite this rotated, but I
Mhm.
love having Hebert in there. But I want Watts at right back if we're going to have Hebert in there. And I agree
That's
with you.
fair.
I do think Hebert's going to play to rotate out a little bit there. My scary part is who's going to play the 2 6s, who's going to be in that double pivot, and someone's going to have tired legs in this one, in my opinion. I would like to kind of see Blom out. I'd like to see Lubin push himself and play 60 at least in this game next to Indy, who ran hard. Both of them ran hard in this last game, so I'm not sure that'll happen. That's what I would risk in this one. But I would rotate a lot of the other. I think AZ can play another 60, so I put him at the 10. And I really think this is a Thoresen game. You got to put in Thoresen. I love that you put in Ostrak because I would actually like to see him start this one just personally. I think
Yeah.
it'll be Stroud, but I'd like to see Thor and Ostrak in this one with Joachini up top.
I'm backtracking on mine, and I don't usually do this, but I am gonna say AZ is going to start this one. I
Yeah.
He was also at the press conference on Thursday. He's facing his former team,
Yes.
Minnesota. Bradley Carnell loves those kinds of stories. You're right. I overlooked that. AZ is going to start in this one, and who he starts for in my lineup, anyone's guess. It could be Watt sliding back at right back, and then AZ in the midfield. Um, Stroud might find his way in there. There's a lot of options, but I this is my takeaway. I would not be surprised to see a rotated lineup.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't mean we're punting anything because remember back to the San Jose, the Colorado, the Toronto games. Rotated lineups can lead to massive success if players are performing at the level that we think they can.
And a game like this, I think the blue collar team scrimmage can kind of win this one. I think so. Let's do our goal guesses before we get out of here. I'm going to say 1-0 City. It's going to be close, but if they keep that clean sheet with Nilsson in there, added in there, I think we could pull away a 1-0 win. Maybe a handball in the box. Who
Oh
knows?
my God. Can we be done? Can we please be done with the handball conversations? Just
Please.
one game. I'm gonna go 1-1. I think we're gonna pull away a point, and it's gonna be a good point. I think going into Minnesota, knowing what they need to do, stealing 2 points from them and getting a draw, that'll be a good performance.
Love it. Thanks for joining me, Matt. Great stuff as always. We're Flyover Footy on the big 550 KTRS. We're clinched, everybody. It feels good. Now let's get that number one spot locked away. We'll be watching together Saturday night against Minnesota. Bye-bye, everybody.
Go City.